My name is Daniel, and I grew up listening to stories from my grandfather, Richard Hargrove. He wasn't the kind of man you'd expect to spin ghost stories or superstitions. Born in the Midwest, raised on hard work, and a believer in logic, Richard spent most of his life as a truck driver before retirement. But after my grandmother passed, bills piled up, and he started driving Uber at night to make ends meet. I was a kid when it happened, but the story has stuck with me. He only told it once, years later, when he was sure I was old enough to handle it. And even then, his hands shook as he recounted every chilling detail. This is his story, the one ride that broke him. The winter of 2011 in Chicago was the kind of winter that bit into the skin like teeth. The city seemed to wear a permanent coat of frost, curling along the sidewalks, climbing up the glass of abandoned storefronts, and dusting the windshields of cars left overnight on narrow streets. The cold wasn't just air, it was presence, heavy and unrelenting, as if the whole city was held in the grip of some invisible hand. My grandfather, Richard Hargrove, knew this cold all too well. At 59 years old, worn down by decades of long hours and hard labor, he was still strong, still steady, though the beard that framed his jaw was flecked with white and his eyes carried a tiredness he could never fully shake. Richard's routine had become second nature. From 5 in the evening until nearly 2 in the morning, he drove. Night after night, he ferried the people who made up Chicago's restless nocturnal life, drunken college students stumbling out of bars near Lincoln Park, office workers too weary to face the train after a long shift downtown, and tourists hopelessly tangled in the city's grid of streets. The work wasn't glamorous, but it was work, and for Richard that had always been enough. That particular night, sometime around midnight, the city had quieted into its loneliest form. The traffic that usually strangled the streets had thinned to a trickle, and the rhythm of the tires against cracked asphalt was the only constant sound in his ears. Then the app chimed, an incoming request. It was near the old bus terminal downtown, a place Richard had always thought of as uncanny after dark, the kind of spot that seemed stuck between movement and abandonment. As he pulled toward the designated pickup, he noticed her even before the app confirmed the match. A woman, standing on the curb, arm raised, signaling him down with urgency. She appeared to be in her late 40s, dressed modestly, nothing extravagant about her appearance. And yet, despite the ordinary way she carried herself, something about her presence struck Richard. Perhaps it was her stillness, or the way her eyes seemed too focused, as though she had been waiting not just for a ride but for him specifically. What caught his attention most of all, however, was the oversized duffel bag she dragged at her side. It was large, awkward, and clearly much too heavy for her slight frame. She struggled visibly, muscles straining, as she tried to maneuver it into the back seat of his car. Richard, ever polite, leaned to offer help, but before he could unbuckle his seatbelt, she had hoisted it clumsily through the door and collapsed onto the seat beside it. The door slammed shut, muffling the sound of the city outside. She gave him an address, somewhere on the west side, a part of the city that, at that hour, felt deserted and half forgotten. The kind of neighborhood where even the shadows seemed reluctant to linger. "All right, no problem," Richard said evenly, nodding once as he adjusted the meter. He stole a glance into the rearview mirror, watching her settle into the seat. Her face was pale under the weak glow of the interior light, her expression taut, as though every muscle in her body carried the same weight as the duffel bag resting at her feet. The car filled with the low hum of the heater, pushing back against the cold, though the warmth seemed to stop short of her. She sat rigidly, staring ahead, not once looking at the passing lights outside the window. Richard tried to focus on the road, letting the rhythm of the drive steady him, but every so often, his eyes drifted back to the mirror. She hadn't moved. The ride itself was uneventful. The streets were fractured with potholes, the tires thumping rhythmically as they rolled over broken pavement. Neon signs glowed faintly above shuttered businesses, their colors dulled in the fogged windows. A few distant headlights flickered, then disappeared into the darkness. Richard concentrated on the road, but unease tugged at him the closer they drew to the west side. Finally, the GPS announced their arrival. Richard slowed, scanning the surroundings. The street was hollow, stripped of life. Every storefront was dark, shutters pulled tight, windows barred. Not a single person moved along the sidewalks. The silence pressed in on him. "You sure you want me to drop you here?" he asked carefully, his voice breaking the stillness. "Yes," she said quickly, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Here is fine." There was something unsettling about the speed of her reply, but Richard said nothing more. She reached into her coat, pulled out the fare, and pressed it into his hand. "Thank you," she murmured, almost too softly to hear. Then she bent forward, clutching the duffel bag with both hands, tugging it toward the door with visible effort. Her shoulders hunched as though she was dragging more than weight, dragging some invisible burden alongside her. She climbed out, her figure swallowed quickly by the shadows of the empty street. Richard watched her for a moment, unsure if he should wait, unsure if she might need help, but something deep in his gut told him to let her go. He didn't argue, didn't ask questions. Instead, he reset the app, shifted the car into gear, and pulled away, leaving the woman and her heavy bag behind in the cold night that belonged more to silence than to the living. A couple of hours slipped by in the quiet rhythm of the night. My grandfather picked up 2 more fares, ordinary trips that barely registered in memory. The first was a young couple heading to a bar, chatting and laughing in the back seat as though the cold outside did not exist. The second, sometime closer to 2 a.m., was a man staggering out of a club, too drunk to speak coherently, his words slurred into nonsense. Richard had carried hundreds like him before, but it was during this ride that something caught his attention, something that would turn an ordinary shift into a memory carved deep into his mind. When the drunk man lurched toward the car, he opened the back door clumsily, fumbling with the handle before collapsing into the seat. His body landed heavy, his head rolling against the window as he tried to steady himself. Richard reached forward, adjusting the rearview mirror just enough to keep an eye on him. That was when he saw the man's foot kick against something, a large, bulky duffel bag resting on the floor. At first, Richard's instinct told him it must belong to the passenger. People left things in cars all the time, backpacks, coats, even grocery bags, but rarely anything that large. He was about to ignore it, chalking it up to the man's belongings, when he heard the passenger mutter under his breath. "Damn luggage in the way," the drunk man grumbled, annoyed, as if it had been an obstacle rather than something he owned. His tone was dismissive, almost resentful, like he couldn't understand why it was there. That was when realization dawned. The woman, the one from earlier with the strained face and trembling hands, she had left it behind. The bag was hers. Somehow, in the rush of getting out, she had forgotten it, leaving it wedged on the floor of his car. Richard's stomach tightened with unease. For the rest of the ride, he found himself distracted, his eyes darting between the drunken passenger and the outline of the duffel bag on the floor. It seemed to fill the back seat with its presence, far heavier than the canvas and plastic it was made of. When the drunk man was finally dropped off at his destination, Richard pulled the car beneath the glow of a lonely street lamp. The halo of yellow light cast long shadows across the interior, emphasizing the dark shape on the floor. He sat there for a long moment, staring at it, weighing his options. On the one hand, it wasn't his business. He could leave it in the trunk of Lost and Found at the company office. He could ignore it completely, keep driving, pretend he hadn't seen it. But his conscience gnawed at him. Someone's property was sitting there, and the only responsible thing to do was to find a way to return it. The problem was, there was no way to know who it belonged to unless he looked inside. He didn't like the idea of rummaging through another person's things. It felt wrong, invasive. Still, there was no other way. If he could just find an ID, or a phone number, or even a letter addressed to her, he could make sure it got back to the right person. He reached for the zipper. His hands trembled as he pulled it open, the metallic teeth of the zipper sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet car. The bag sagged open reluctantly, revealing its contents. For a split second, Richard froze, his breath caught in his throat. Inside, lying in disconnected pieces, was what appeared to be a body. His mind screamed at him to slam the bag shut, to turn away, to deny what he was seeing. The first thing his eyes registered was a pale hand, limp and unnatural, sticking out from the mess of fabric. The color, in the dim light, looked almost real. His chest constricted, panic surging through him as he recoiled, convinced he was staring at human flesh. But when he forced himself to touch it, his fingers met not the warmth of skin but the cold, hard surface of plastic. A mannequin. The bag was full of mannequin parts. A torso bent awkwardly, arms and legs twisted at odd angles, and a face molded into a stiff, artificial smile. All of it stuffed into the duffel bag like spare parts tossed into storage. Richard exhaled, a nervous laugh escaping him despite the unease clawing at his stomach. Relief washed through him, though it was thin, fragile, and already fading. He shook his head, chastising himself for overreacting. A mannequin. That was all it was. Nothing more. Still, the image of that frozen smile, pressed against the side of the bag, lingered in his mind. It didn't feel like just a mannequin. It felt like something watching him. He zipped the bag shut quickly, almost too quickly, as though closing it would erase the unsettling image from existence. He told himself he would handle it in the morning. He would drive back downtown, return it to the same spot where he had picked up the woman, and hope to see her there again. That was the plan. Simple. Reasonable. But as Richard sat there beneath the street lamp, the quiet hum of the heater filling the car, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Something about the night no longer felt ordinary. The mannequin had been harmless enough in appearance, yet its presence in his back seat radiated unease, as though it had carried more than plastic and plaster into his car. He glanced into the rearview mirror one last time. The bag sat there, zipped up, silent. Yet in the reflection, it looked heavier than ever, a dark shape that didn't belong in his world. Richard drove home with the bag still in the back seat, convincing himself that everything would be fine in the morning. But deep down, he knew. This was just the beginning. Richard lived alone in a small house off Cicero Avenue, tucked between two aging brick duplexes that had seen better days. His home was modest, one story, faded siding, a roof that leaked when the spring rains came. It wasn't much, but it was his. What mattered most to him wasn't the house itself but the garage that sat just a few feet away. That garage was his sanctuary, the place where he kept his car locked tight every night after his shift. With crime on the rise in the city, Richard always said the only way to sleep soundly was to know his vehicle was sealed away, safe behind bolted doors. That night had been long, colder than usual, and exhaustion hung on him like a weight. His body ached from hours behind the wheel, his eyes burned, and all he wanted was the comfort of his worn recliner and a few hours of dreamless rest. The duffel bag still sat on the back seat when he pulled into the garage, its contents sealed away once again. He thought about dragging it inside, leaving it by the door until morning, but a wave of dread crawled up his spine. He didn't want that thing in his house. Plastic or not, mannequin or not, it unsettled him. So he made a decision. He'd leave the bag in the back seat, lock the doors, and deal with it tomorrow. he convinced himself there was no harm in waiting. The garage was secure, every lock double-checked. Whatever was inside that bag couldn't move, couldn't cause him trouble. At least, that's what he told himself as he closed the garage door, turned the bolt, and walked toward the quiet of his empty home. Sleep came quickly, though not peacefully. Richard dreamed of faces, not human faces, but mold ones, frozen in half-smiles and empty stares. He woke several times in the night, his skin clammy, his heart pounding, yet each time he shook it off as the lingering effect of an overactive imagination. By the time the sun crept high into the winter sky, fatigue dragged him back under, and he slept well into the afternoon. When he finally stirred, the world outside was still locked in the grip of bitter cold. The afternoon light filtered pale and weak through the blinds as he pulled on his coat and prepared to face the garage. A pit formed in his stomach, though he couldn't say why. Perhaps it was the memory of the mannequin's smile, or perhaps it was simply dread he couldn't shake. Richard pressed the button to raise the garage door, expecting to see the same car he had left hours before. But the moment the door rattled open, he froze. The duffel bag was no longer on the seat. His breath caught in his throat. The bag, the same heavy one he had zipped up himself, now lay open and slumped on the floor. And sitting upright in the back seat, fully assembled, was the mannequin. Its head tilted forward slightly, as though studying the steering wheel. Its limbs were attached, its posture unnervingly human, and its face, its face, was different. The mold plastic grin, which had once seemed faint, now stretched wide, exaggerated, a caricature of joy that twisted into something sinister. Richard staggered backward, his hand clutching at his chest as a wave of panic overtook him. His eyes darted to the locks on the garage. Still bolted. Still sealed. The car's doors remained closed, the windows unbroken. There was no way in. No one could have entered, no one could have assembled it. Logic, his lifelong companion, failed him in that moment. For long minutes, he stood there, his breath fogging in the cold air, staring at the figure in the car. His mind raced, trying to force reason into what he saw. Maybe he had assembled it in a daze. Maybe he had dreamed of zipping the bag shut. Maybe fatigue had scrambled his memory. He reached for any explanation that wasn't the one clawing at the back of his mind, that it had moved on its own. But no explanation held. The longer he stared, the more undeniable the truth became. Finally, gathering what courage he could, Richard edged closer. Each step echoed against the concrete floor, each breath sounding louder in his ears. He forced himself to grip the handle of the driver's side door, his hand trembling violently. Slowly, carefully, he climbed inside. The mannequin loomed behind him, its presence suffocating. Richard couldn't stand the thought of leaving it there, waiting in the back seat, watching. He couldn't sleep another night knowing it was in his garage. He had to find the woman who had left it, had to return it, had to rid himself of it before it drove him mad. As he sat in the driver's seat, he dared one glance in the rearview mirror. The mannequin's head seemed to angle ever so slightly, its empty eyes locked on his reflection. Richard swallowed hard, started the engine, and told himself he would not look back again. The drive downtown felt longer than any trip Richard had ever taken. Every block seemed stretched, every stoplight lingering on red just a little too long. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles pale under the dim glow of the dashboard. The heater hummed against the bitter cold, but his body shivered uncontrollably. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't stop himself from glancing upward into the rearview mirror. At first, the mannequin remained exactly as it had been when he left the garage, sitting stiffly in the back seat, head tilted forward, its grotesque smile frozen in place. For several minutes, Richard convinced himself that maybe, just maybe, this was all in his head. Perhaps fatigue had twisted his memories, perhaps paranoia had planted false images in his mind. He tried to breathe steadily, to remind himself it was nothing more than mold plastic. But then it happened. In one quick, startling flicker, the mannequin's eyes shifted. They weren't supposed to move. They weren't real eyes, only painted features carved into synthetic skin. Yet Richard swore on everything he knew, those eyes had darted upward, just slightly, locking onto his in the mirror. The breath in his lungs turned sharp and shallow. His foot slipped against the gas, and he nearly barreled through a red light. Brakes squealed beneath him as the car lurched to a stop in the middle of the intersection. Horns blared furiously from behind, the angry shouts of other drivers echoing through the frozen night. Still, Richard sat there, motionless, his heart pounding so violently he thought he might pass out. It took another angry honk to break him from his paralysis. He forced the car forward, his hands trembling against the wheel, his body drenched in cold sweat. Every instinct within him screamed to abandon the vehicle, leave it right there in the street, flee on foot, and never look back. But logic, stubborn and fragile, kept him tethered. If he left the car, he would lose everything. His livelihood, his only source of money, his last grip on normalcy. And so, despite the horror clawing at him, he pressed onward. His eyes never stopped flicking to the mirror. Each time, he half expected to see the mannequin leaning closer, its head moving inch by inch toward him. Sometimes he thought he saw the slightest twitch in its jaw, the faintest gleam in its eyes. He could no longer tell if it was imagination or reality. His fear blurred the line between the two, binding him in a tightening knot of dread. When he finally reached the downtown district, his body was so tense that his shoulders ached. He parked near the old bus terminal, the same place where he had first encountered the woman with the heavy bag. The lot was dimly lit, half empty, shadows stretching unnaturally long across cracked pavement. Richard could not bring himself to stay inside the car. The thought of sitting there, trapped in close quarters with the mannequin's silent stare, was unbearable. He shut the engine off, shoved the door open, and climbed out with unsteady legs. For hours, he paced along the curb. His breath puffed in pale clouds, his eyes scanning every passing face. The cold gnawed at him, but he refused to retreat into the vehicle. Each time his gaze wandered back, he saw it, still sitting there in the back seat, still smiling. Whether its eyes followed him or not, he could no longer be certain. Time crawled. The crowd around the terminal shifted and changed, people coming and going, but Richard remained. Anxiety gnawed at his insides, fear growing heavier with each hour that passed without resolution. He began to wonder if she would ever come back. And then, at last, just as the city clocks chimed 10, he saw her. At first, she didn't recognize him. She walked with her head lowered, bundled against the cold, moving briskly toward the dimly lit street. Richard's chest tightened, panic mixing with fury. He shouted after her, his voice echoing across the empty sidewalk. "You left something in my car." She stopped. Her shoulders stiffened, but she didn't turn. When she finally glanced back, her face darkened, her expression shifting from surprise to dread. Without a word, she tried to move faster, her steps quickening as though she could outrun both him and the truth. Richard would not allow it. He darted forward, blocking her path, his fear bleeding into anger. His voice trembled but held a desperate edge. "You need to take this back," he demanded. "That thing, it doesn't belong to me. It doesn't belong anywhere near me." The woman froze. Her eyes flicked toward the car, where the silhouette of the mannequin still sat in the back seat, its face pressed against the glass. She swallowed hard, her lips parting as though the words themselves carried poison. "I'm sorry," she whispered at last, her voice barely audible. I didn't know what else to do. Richard stared at her, confused, terrified, and furious all at once. She lowered her gaze, then began to speak, her words spilling out like a confession she could no longer contain. The mannequin, she explained, was never meant to be just plastic. Her daughter, shattered by grief after losing her father to cancer, had taken it to a woman who claimed to be a witch. In desperation, the girl begged for a ritual that would let her father's spirit return, housed inside the figure, so she could keep him close. But the ritual went wrong. After that night, the house changed. Strange voices whispered in the darkness. Shadows crawled across walls where no light should fall. Objects shattered without reason, doors slammed on their own, and the family lived in constant fear. The presence inside the mannequin did not behave like the man they had loved. It was cruel, heavy, oppressive. Whatever had entered that plastic shell, it was not her husband, it was something darker, something malicious. So, terrified and desperate, the woman had tried to abandon it. She had carried it into Richard's car, leaving the burden with him in the hope she could finally escape it. Richard's fury boiled over. His voice cracked as he shouted, his fear now sharpened into rage. "And you thought you could dump it on me?" His hands trembled, his breath clouding in the frozen air. "You don't leave things like that with strangers. You don't pass off your curse to someone else. You take it back. Now." Tears welled in her eyes. Her resolve crumbled, and she nodded. Together, they walked back to the car. She reached in with shaking hands, gripped the mannequin's stiff shoulders, and dragged it out into the night. The moment it left his vehicle, Richard swore he felt the air shift. The crushing pressure that had weighed on him for hours seemed to lift, leaving behind a silence that felt strangely clean. For the first time that night, he could breathe. Richard did not drive another fare that night. The moment the mannequin was dragged from his car, the relief he felt was sharp but fragile, like a fragile glass that could shatter at any second. He climbed into the driver's seat with shaking hands, turned the ignition, and drove home in silence, every muscle tight with lingering dread. When he reached his small house, he parked inside the garage and locked the door with a precision that bordered on obsession. He checked every bolt twice, then 3 times, before stepping into the house. Once inside, he locked the front door, the back door, and even wedged a chair beneath the knob for good measure. Fear gnawed at him, convincing him that locks alone could not keep the darkness away. He did not sleep. Instead, he sat in his recliner, a worn Bible clutched tightly in his calloused hands. The lamplight flickered faintly across the pages as he whispered prayers into the silence, begging for protection, for safety, for peace. Outside, the winter wind howled through the eaves of the house, and each sound made him flinch. He stayed awake until dawn, his body stiff, his eyes bloodshot, his faith the only shield against the terror still hanging over him. He never saw the woman again. Not in the neighborhood, not at the terminal, not anywhere. It was as if she had disappeared, swallowed by the city, leaving only the memory of her trembling hands and the cursed object she had tried to abandon. Richard never searched for her. Part of him hoped she had found a way to rid herself of that thing once and for all. Another part feared the truth, that whatever was inside the mannequin had destroyed her life completely. Years later, when he finally shared the story with me, his grandson, he admitted something he had not told anyone else. Even after the mannequin was gone, it never truly left him. For weeks afterward, Richard claimed, he continued to see its face. Sometimes in the bathroom mirror while brushing his teeth, sometimes faintly reflected in the darkened window as he passed by, and other times, worst of all, in the rearview mirror of his own car. Each glimpse was fleeting, but each one froze him with terror. The same wide, twisted smile. The same hollow eyes that seemed to follow him, no matter where he looked. He prayed constantly, lighting candles, reciting verses, and asking for divine protection. He placed small crosses above every door, sprinkled holy water in the corners of his home, and even slept with the Bible resting against his chest. Gradually, the visions grew weaker. The face appeared less often, fading into the shadows until one day it was gone completely. Richard never forgot, though. He carried the memory of that smile like a scar etched into his mind. From then on, he set a rule for himself. He still drove Uber, but never again past 10 o'clock at night. Hearing him recount it, I could see the toll it had taken. This wasn't a ghost story he enjoyed retelling. This was trauma carved into his memory. And he ended with a warning, one I now carry with me. Daniel, don't ever mess with things you don't understand. People think they can bring their loved ones back, but sometimes the door they open doesn't let family through, it lets monsters in. Stay away from that kind of darkness. Promise me. I promised. And I've never forgotten.